Welcome to the Gospel Activist Podcast in association with Stepping Out Ministries, where we explore how we proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ in our modern context. Here is your host, pastor and evangelist, Kevin Henry.
Well, welcome back to the Gospel Activist Podcast. And on this episode, we're continuing our conversation on the church health component of evangelism. Before we get to the content, though, I would like to invite you to comment about this episode down below. I'd love to interact with you that way, or even through email. If you have a question or would like to ask a question that I can answer on the podcast. Also, I invite you to rate below as well. Well, in the last episode, we talked about the church's responsibility is to proclaim the gospel and also to send out the church to proclaim the gospel. We continue that subject now with our third point on the responsibility of the church. And that is the church's responsibility is the gospel. Mark 16:15 we had read in the last episode. We'll read it again here, and it says this again. Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. Jesus is saying these words to his disciples just before he ascends to heaven. So as he's speaking to all of them there, he's speaking to the entire church. Church, it is your responsibility now to proclaim the gospel. I'm reminded of a story. It's obviously not a true story, but I think it illustrates this point well. One day in heaven, some of his disciples asked Jesus, what if the rest of the disciples fail in this? What if they don't proclaim the gospel? Do you have a plan B? And Jesus says back, no, I only have a plan A. Jesus has given us this great responsibility. And really it's an honor that he has given us this responsibility to be cared for such an important and awesome message, to care for those who are lost by sharing the gospel, telling them of their need for Jesus, why he died on the cross for their sins, to give them forgiveness of their sins, if they surrender their lives to him. What an important message for us to proclaim. So Jesus has given us, the church, that responsibility to go and proclaim the gospel. Why is evangelism the responsibility of the whole church? Well, first of all, again, because Jesus called the disciples to go and do it. He has called each one of us as Christians. It's not just the pastor's responsibility. You know, there's some churches who will hire an evangelism pastor, and that's fine to equip the church and be an example to the church. Sometimes they expect that evangelism pastor to do all of the work. Or if they have just one pastor in the church, they expect that one pastor to do all the evangelistic work. They'll say, oh, well, we'll plan an event to invite people to come to, but you would be the one who preaches the gospel. No, it's all of our responsibility. It's the whole church's responsibility to proclaim the gospel. Because we're all called to go and make disciples. And part of making disciples is proclaiming the gospel. Also, if we love Jesus, we'll obey his commands. And since Jesus' command is to go and make disciples, to proclaim the gospel, we then must go and do it if we love Jesus. Jesus will build his church through a few ways. First, through his people. Mark 16:18 says, Matthew 16:18 says, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Jesus did say that he will build his church, true, but he said upon Peter he would build his church. Upon each one of us, he builds his church, because he calls us to proclaim the gospel. So he will build his church through us, as he works in and through us. Next, Jesus will build his church through the proclamation of the gospel. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 5 says, for what we proclaim is not ourselves. That's very important to remember, isn't it? We don't proclaim ourselves, but Jesus Christ is Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. Paul, as he's writing this letter to the church in Corinth, is given some important words to us. That we don't preach ourselves, we proclaim Jesus Christ only, and as ourselves as servants of Jesus Christ, for Christ's sake. That's why we proclaim the gospel. Because Christ called us to do it, and when people are lost, they need the gospel. They need to come to faith in Jesus Christ. Because if they don't accept Christ, hell is where their destination is in after this life. And as we know from Scripture, it's an awful, awful place. A place of torture, torment, a place of darkness, of pain and suffering, and there's no relief from it. As true Christians, we wouldn't want our worst enemies to go to hell. So it's important for us to proclaim that gospel, to proclaim the words of the gospel. So now that we understand the importance of evangelism for the church because we're called by Christ to do it, how do we go about that then? So here's some questions to consider for yourself and for your church in order to encourage your church to be actively involved in evangelism together. First, ask yourself, how can our church work together to spread the gospel to our community? What spiritual gifts are in your church? Personalities, abilities. How can you pull all that together and work together to reach the gospel, reach your community with the gospel? Now, as I say go, I've said go in last podcast and this one, we're to go and preach the gospel. Doesn't mean that we can't do invitational activities. This is what I call the rule of eights. It takes about 8 times and also 8 Christians to influence a non-believer on average before they come to faith. So yes, we want to have more Christians around non-believers to influence them, and so they hear the gospel more frequently. But there's a way to work together as a whole church to do that together. Whether it be a small event going into the community, or whether it be an invitational to invite them to come to something that the church is putting on. Also, how can your church work together to spread the gospel to your friends, your family, and neighbors? Yes, we're all called to do personal evangelism, but how can we invite maybe another person or two who are part of our church to be involved in the life of that friend or neighbor or loved one? Again, it's working together to reach the community. Next, how can we use our spiritual gifts to proclaim the gospel? I mentioned that moments ago. Each one of us has at least 2 spiritual gifts, if not more. And each of them can be used for spiritual gifts. Some of us sometimes say, though, but I don't have the spiritual gift of evangelism. Well, there is no spiritual gift of evangelism. When people talk about the gift of evangelism, they get that from Ephesians chapter 4, when it talks about the 5-fold ministry. Yes, evangelism is a gift that God has given to the church in evangelists who come to equip the church and be an example to the church of evangelism. But there is no spiritual gift of evangelism. God has given you some wonderful spiritual gifts to be able to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. And every single one of those spiritual gifts can be used to proclaim. It may take some creativity that God gives you, but God will use your spiritual gifts to proclaim the gospel. Lastly, what is God telling us to do to reach the lost? I said earlier, it's important as a church to be in prayer and asking God, Lord, how are we to reach the lost in our community? How are we to be a light to our community for you? So it's important to ask that question. And then spend that time waiting and hearing from God what you are to do as a church together to reach the community. It's very important. You know, there's a lot written about different ideas and different programs for evangelism, and some of those are great and wonderful. And to use those as God leads you to use them, but there's the key again, as God leads you. God will guide your church if you listen to God in how you're to reach your community, because God knows what your community needs to hear the gospel. Listen to God and follow His direction. And He will soften your community to hear the gospel, and He'll work in and through you as a church to reach your community and reach the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I can't say this enough. Pray, pray, pray. Listen to God and then evangelize the way God is directing you and your church to do. Evangelism is the way the church will grow. And Jesus has called us as his church to proclaim that good news to those who are lost. If your church is not sharing the gospel, it's not going to be effective. It's not about saying, why don't you come to our church? But it's going to the people and sharing the gospel. God will grow the church, just as he said to Peter. So allow God to work in you and through you and the whole church to bring in more of a harvest of disciples for Jesus Christ. I mentioned the last podcast, and I'd like to mention this to you again. Another tool that I have is this booklet on evangelism. It's a tool that you can use to be discipled and disciple others in how to share the gospel. What are some of the ways and some of the tools out there that we can use to share the gospel? The key, though, is to be equipped and to equip others. When we talk about discipleship in a previous episode, evangelism is part of that. Discipling each other in how to share the gospel. So here's one tool. Or I'm also available to come to your church to do a seminar and workshop on evangelism. If you'd like to converse with me about that, I invite you to email me through the contact page on our website, steppingoutministries.com. And I'd love to interact with you and figure out what would work for to come in to share how to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with your church. Also, I'd like to invite you again to comment below. I'd love to interact with you in the comment section. And please rate this video as well, too. Also, if you have a question for the podcast, I invite you to send that to me by the email address in the description below. And I'd love to interact with you in that way as well. In our next episode, we're going to be continuing our series on components of a healthy church. Next time, looking, though, at the component of prayer. Until next time, this is Pastor Kevin reminding you to preach the gospel to anyone, anywhere, anytime, and at no matter the cost.
You have been listening to the Gospel Activist Podcast in association with Stepping Out Ministries. To submit a comment or question for Pastor Kevin to answer on the podcast, visit us at www.steppingoutministries.com. Thank you for listening, and we invite you to join us for our next podcast.